What's up, Janky fam? Today I'm going to answer a question, or more accurately, a series of questions that gets asked non-stop by people looking to get into drifting. That question generally being some variation of, what's the best beginner drift car? Or what's the best cheap drift car? And here's a sampling of the 9,000 other ways I've seen this question asked. Now, kind of like asking your mom and dad how babies are made, there's no shame in having these questions. Obviously, every veteran drifter has been in your shoes at some point. Some of us are just much better at using Google. Nonetheless, take a seat and Papa Jank is going to talk you through the birds and bees of choosing your first drift car. In addition to what I consider to be the top 5 best drift cars for anyone looking to get into drifting, I'm also going to talk about the top 3 worst drift cars that you should avoid like your life depends on it. To clarify before we fully jump in, the top 5 are all going to be actual cars. For the worst 3, I will talk about a few specific cars, but overall it'll lean more towards common scenarios and mistakes people make when getting into the hobby. Anyway, let's jump in with the top 3 worst drift cars you can buy as a beginner. Number 3, gonna piss a lot of people off with this one, but stick with me for the explanation, please. The Nissan S chassis. For the newbies, that includes the S13 through S15, also frequently known as the 240SX, 180SX, 200SX, or whatever versions are available locally to you. Now, I'm sure your knee-jerk reaction was, this guy has no idea what the f he's talking about. And to clarify, I am in no way saying that these cars aren't good at drifting. They've been prolific in the drift scene for decades at this point, and I would even say were key in helping to launch drifting to the level of fame it has today. Hell, when I first decided that I was going to start drifting, I wanted an S13 hatch. They are one of my favorite cars of all time. The problem with the S chassis is that they have been destroyed and sent to the scrap heap at such a rate that they are now effectively rare in most areas. You still see a bunch of them at drift events, but replacement parts are getting harder to find, and everything for this chassis is selling at a premium. I pretty consistently see these for sale for like 5 to 8 grand, either completely gutted, torn apart, missing parts, or just straight rusted to shit. It's an unfortunate trend that every time a car gets popular within the drift community, it incurs something called drift tax, which is basically a cutesy way of saying that the prices are ridiculously inflated because a large portion of said car have been clapped out, wrecked, or left to rot in a field for 20 years. Then the current owners know they can charge a premium because people will continue paying the ridiculous prices. And given the S13 and S14 are effectively the most popular drift cars of all time, they've been hit the most. As with anything, you can still find some deals, but for the same amount of money, there are much better options that won't leave you stuck dealing with someone's way overpriced, beat to shit rust box. You're probably gonna have this romantic fantasy in your head about owning one, but if you resist the temptation, you will thank me in the end. That said, I would probably trade my Z for an LS S13 hatch tomorrow if someone asked. Number 2, anything super unique or super custom. I can't tell you how many people I've encountered on the internet or even at events who have this grandiose dream about their first drift car. Here's an exaggerated example. Would an FB RX-7 with a Dodge Viper engine be a good first drift car? No. As cool as that sounds, the best first drift car is something that gets you consistent and efficient seat time. Unique projects are cool as hell, but they don't keep you on the track. Instead, you wind up staring at it on jack stands while your friends are out on the track. If you pick a chassis that is widely used within the drift community, you'll have your pick of drift upgrades with options from multiple companies, as well as a lot of community support and knowledge. If you pick a chassis that's not widely supported or used, you'll be cursing yourself as you try to fashion an angle kit out of toothpicks and rubber bands like a shitty version of MacGyver. As a more specific example, I've seen a handful of people running Subaru WRX drift cars, which again is cool as hell, but the EJ blows up if you park it too aggressively, never mind bouncing it off the rev limiter going sideways. There's a reason you see a lot of the same cars and setups at your local track. If you keep it simple, you'll keep it reliable, and you'll maximize your seat time. Number 1, your daily driver, or basically any car that you can't afford to wreck. This season I came across a number of folks at events who just bought something like a brand new Subaru BRZ and decided they wanted to take a shot at drifting. I love to see new folks getting into this hobby, but if you're in a situation where your daily and your drift car are one and the same, you are setting yourself up for a bad time. Drifting is super abrasive to your car, and beyond bouncing off the rev limiter, it's not uncommon to find yourself sliding off track. Sometimes off track is just more dirt, and other times it's a stack of tires that's much harder than you think, or even a cement wall. I've been drifting for 2 years now, and I've seen 2 cars flip and probably 3 to 4 that were total write-offs. And you might think that's not gonna happen because you're a good driver, you'll be careful, or some of your friends do it and they're fine. But there's a saying within the motorcycle community that I think applies here as well, which essentially says that it's not if you crash, it's when. Realistically, it only takes one bad lap or even one bad turn for even the best driver to wreck a $20,000 plus car. And if that's your main source of transportation, you are screwed. I feel like I'm the fun police and I hate to say this, but if you can't afford to have a separate drift drift car from your daily, maybe consider that you aren't ready to dive into this hobby. All right, now that I feel like I just went on a 5-minute rant, let's jump into the more fun stuff. Top 5 best beginner drift cars. Quick plug to say that from my perspective, your first drift setup should definitely be a sim racing rig. The initial price tag can be high, but you will save a ridiculous amount of money learning on sim before moving over to real life. I talk about just how much it saved me in my first drift season in this video. Check it out. Anyway, number 5. Mazda Miata. For a long time, you didn't see these cars in the drift scene, and a lot of that being because the short wheelbase and lower power makes them more snappy and harder to keep sideways compared to your more stereotypical drift cars. As a general rule of thumb, having a longer wheelbase makes for slower and smoother transitions, while having higher power makes it easier to keep the rear broken loose without having to lean as much on momentum and weight transfer. The Miata being the exact opposite on both accounts means that you need to become a good driver to race or drift that chassis effectively. Regardless, Miatas have long been seen as giant killers when piloted by someone who knows what they're doing, and there's been a boom in Miatas at drift events. The main reason, I think, being money. Compared to a lot of the other options, you can still get some great deals on used Miatas. Used parts are still relatively plentiful, the drift aftermarket is continuing to grow for this chassis, and the pizza cutter sized tires are super cheap. Buying one of these as your first drift car is probably a bit like starting on hard mode, but people tear it up on these things, and it will force you to become a good driver. You're also going to spend a ton less money than someone with 300 horsepower burning up wider and much more expensive tires. If cost is your biggest focus, Miatas are a great choice for your first drift car. Number 4, in the complete opposite direction, the C5 or C6 Corvette. These cars speak for themselves in terms of overall prestige and performance. You get a race design chassis with a powerful V8, a huge aftermarket including angle kits and other drift mods, and they even come with a complimentary pair of white New Balance sneakers. Cargo shorts are also a popular add-on, but not required. But all kidding aside, this is another chassis that's building momentum within the drift community. Partially because the prices are coming down, and partially because they are beasts on the track. If you've been to a drift event, you've probably seen that a lot of the higher level guys are running some variation of the LS engine, which the Vettes already come with. And if you look at the cost of doing a V8 swap on another chassis, it can be in the ballpark of $10,000+ depending on your resources and fabrication skills. Drifting, even at a grassroots level, is also skewing towards higher grip setups, and the Vettes already have a leg up in that regard as well with their lower center of gravity and wider track width. Honestly, it is hard to build another car to match the performance of a Vette that won't cost more than just buying a Vette. That said, the main drawbacks being that used parts and roller chassis aren't widely available, so if you eat a wall, that is going to be a super expensive mistake. I don't think I've personally seen a roller C5 or C6, and roller effectively meaning bare chassis without engine or transmission, for less than like $8,000. In comparison, the other cars on this list have much better used parts availability, and you can even find rollers on the others for less than $1,000 to $2,000. So overall, this car is a good option for someone who wants a higher level drift car without much effort and has pockets deep enough to keep it on the road. Even in terms of consumables, these things feast on tires, so it's a great drift chassis, but expensive to keep going. Number 3, the SN95 Mustang. Outside of the Terminator, I feel like the SN95 is kind of like the forgotten Mustang generation. I think part of that might be because the bubbly ones are some of the ugliest cars ever made, which is completely subjective, but nonetheless, these things are a low-key great choice for a first drift car. And here's why. First, because people don't like them as much as the Fox bodies and S197s, they don't have the same inflated pricing, which means that you can effectively get a V8 muscle car for dirt cheap. Yes, the power from that V8, especially in the early years, kind of sucks at 215 horsepower, but it also puts out almost 300 pounds of torque. Those aren't world-beating numbers, but they're damn sure enough to go sideways. Second, those chassis are built like tanks, and given how many V6 versions got sold, there are still tons of used parts and roller chassis floating around for when you inevitably crash or break something. Engines are also pretty interchangeable between a few different Ford cars at the time, so even that could be a relatively quick and cheap swap if you blow it up. Third, a lot of these cars have been previously modded for extra power and better handling by previous owners, which could potentially save you a bunch of money because you never get back the money you put in. Overall, this to me is a good cheap car to get your foot in the door and not worry about smashing the shit out of. I don't know that I'd personally try to build one beyond an intro level car, especially with the solid axle generally being a step behind cars with independent rear suspension, but still a great choice for a car that hasn't been impacted as much by drift tax. Number 2, the BMW E36 and E46. German cars have a stigma for being unreliable, overcomplicated, and expensive to repair. However, the amount of engineering that goes into these cars is ridiculous, which is why Toyota decided to slap their badge on the new BMW Supra. Essentially, you can mod pretty much any rear-wheel drive car to slide well enough, but having a precision-tuned, well-balanced chassis with a 50-50 weight distribution goes a long way towards building a car that feels like it was made to slide. And I feel like that's what you get when you go with the E36 and E46. One of the struggles with these cars is that there are so many different variations, like the 318i, 323, 325, 328, 330, and so on, that you really need to be mindful of which one you're picking up and what features that model comes with, especially in terms of engine and transmission, as the ones I rattled off come with anywhere from 120 to 230 horsepower. And as much as people say you don't need power to drift, having power definitely makes your life easier. So aim for something over 200 horsepower and ideally grab a 330 model if you can swing it. Now the good news about all the different models is that I believe most of them share the same body and or components, so you'll find this is another car with decent used parts and chassis availability. On top of that, because of the stigma with these being older pre-owned German cars with high mileage, people generally sell them for dirt cheap. I believe out of the box the main thing you have to do with them is weld the diff and reinforce the rear subframe mounting points, and while I unfortunately haven't drifted one yet, people rave about the E36 and E46 in terms of how well these things handle and how smoothly they drift. I think if I was going to do a full scratch build, it would be an E46, but great intro drift car, even in stock form, and a great chassis to do a full build on. Number 1, the 350Z. I mentioned earlier that I wanted an S13, and while that was a dream I gave up pretty quickly on, the 350Z is basically the modern day equivalent to the S chassis. You see loads of these things at events, and for good reason. They're effectively a drift car from the factory. Weld the diff, hit the track, and roast some tires. I mean, the stock suspension is probably a little sloppy, but it is sport tuned, and the car comes with 290 plus horsepower and around 270 pounds of torque. The VQ engine sounds like someone farting through a trumpet, but it's proven time and again that it can stand up to a ton of abuse bouncing off the rev limiter in severe conditions. Even the later versions of the CD transmissions are super reliable, and people bolt them up to LS swaps all the time because they can handle the power. Similar to most of the previous cars, the Z also has great used parts and chassis availability. I don't doubt that if someone caved my door in during a tandem, that I can go grab a door the very next day for a decent price. And then of course the aftermarket is huge. That said, there's definitely been some drift hacks on the 350Z, with both cars for sale and parts trending progressively more expensive, but it is nowhere near the inflation and ridiculousness you find with the S chassis. Now I realize I own a Z and people are going to think I'm being a homer, but when I first started looking for a car, I was leaning towards an E46 BMW because I thought the Z was overdone and ugly as shit. From a chassis perspective, the E46 probably has a leg up on the 350Z, for example having a perfect weight distribution versus I believe 5347 for the Z. If I were going for a huge build out of the gate, I probably would have leaned towards the BMW, but stock for stock, the 350Z is objectively the best current overall package out of the box when you look at all factors. The Vette, for example, would obviously win from a performance perspective, Miata, Mustang, or BMW for price, but looking holistically, I don't think there's currently a better first drift car you can buy than the Nissan 350Z. Anyway, that completes our main list, but I did want to call out a few honorable mentions. The first being the BRZ and GT86. It was a hard decision to leave those off, but they're still on the expensive side for what you actually get. I do, however, think that there will be a time when they are a majority car at events. Maybe in a decade or so once they've had time to depreciate. I also didn't mention the G35, 37, or 370Z, which for the most part I would lump into the 350Z portion. And again, I realize the S13 and S14 are probably considered some of the best drift cars of all time, but given availability and price, they just aren't really worth it anymore, unfortunately. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you folks think. I know there's someone out there who just hate watched the rest of this video after I shit talked the S chassis in the beginning, so now's your time to shine. As always, I am more than happy to answer any questions in the comments, as long as you don't ask me what the best beginner drift car is after I just busted my ass on this 10-minute plus video. But I'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching. Please consider commenting, liking, and subscribing, as that helps the channel probably more than you realize. If you want to help the channel more directly, maybe consider buying one of these super cool vinyls from the Janky shop. Otherwise, I guess, just watch some more videos.